My name is Harold Bennett, and I am 81 years old. 2 months ago, at my grandson's Thanksgiving dinner, my great-nephew found an old set of dog tags in a box I'd brought along. Holiday decorations mixed in with a few personal items I'd forgotten to sort out beforehand. He held them up, jangling them for laughs, and asked the table if I'd bought them at a novelty shop for a costume party sometime. Several people laughed. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang, and when my grandson answered it, a 4-star general in full-dress uniform stood on the porch, having driven 2 hours specifically to see me, and the moment he stepped through that door and found me at the table, he came to full attention and saluted, in front of everyone who'd just been laughing at a novelty costume. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you'll want to see exactly what that general said once the room went silent. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that Thanksgiving table, because otherwise those dog tags won't mean what they're supposed to mean. I enlisted in the Army in 1962, 19 years old, following in the footsteps of an older brother who'd served in Korea a decade earlier. I remember my mother crying at the bus station the day I left for basic training, and I remember my father, a quiet man who rarely showed much emotion, shaking my hand and telling me simply that he was proud of me, a sentiment that meant more to me at 19 than I fully understood at the time. I served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1971. Years I still, even now, 6 decades later, don't discuss in detail with most people, because some things that happened in those years live somewhere below language, in places words simply don't reach cleanly. I want to tell you, carefully, about one specific memory that shapes everything about why those dog tags matter as much as they do. In the spring of 1968, during an ambush that has stayed with me every day since, I lost 4 men from my unit, soldiers I had personally trained, young men whose faces I still see clearly whenever November arrives and Thanksgiving approaches, the anniversary of that ambush falling, cruelly, almost exactly alongside the holiday every single year. I carried 2 of those men's bodies myself, over ground I still occasionally revisit in dreams I've learned, across decades, how to survive without fully escaping. I wore my dog tags through that ambush, through the months that followed, through 2 more tours after it, and those specific pieces of metal have never once, in 57 years since, left my possession. I came home in 1971 to a country that, by that point in the war, had grown deeply weary and often openly hostile toward the men returning from it. I remember landing at an airport in California and being told by an airline employee to change out of my uniform in the restroom before continuing to my connecting flight, because wearing it publicly, she explained, apologetically but firmly, might provoke an unpleasant scene. I did what she asked. I've thought about that moment more times over the decades than almost any single moment from the war itself, the particular strange indignity of coming home from something that had cost me pieces of myself I'm still, in some ways, searching for, only to be told my uniform itself was a liability. I remember standing in that airport restroom, folding my uniform into a duffel bag, changing into civilian clothes a relative had mailed ahead for exactly this purpose, understanding, even at 28 years old, that the country I'd served had complicated, painful feelings about men like me that I would spend decades learning how to navigate. I stayed in the Army after that, because I genuinely didn't know how to be anything else, and because the structure and purpose it provided felt, at the time, like the only solid ground available to me. I spent the following 22 years building a career primarily in training and personnel command, work that shaped young soldiers and later, young officers, teaching them the particular discipline and judgment that combat had taught me at a cost I wouldn't wish on anyone. I retired in 1993 as a command sergeant major, one of the highest enlisted ranks the Army offers, a rank that represents not battlefield glory but decades of accumulated judgment, the kind of quiet, foundational authority that officers rely on, precisely because it's built from having actually lived every level of the experience they're now leading others through. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to the rest of this story. My dog tags, the ones my great-nephew found in that box and mistook for a novelty costume prop, are the actual tags I wore across 3 tours in Vietnam, through firefights and losses I still carry, through a specific ambush in 1968 that took the lives of 4 men I'd trained personally, men whose names I still say quietly to myself every November, around this exact time of year, the anniversary always arriving, uninvited, right alongside Thanksgiving itself. My wife Dorothy passed 7 years ago, and since then I've lived alone in a modest house outside of Fort Benning, Georgia, close enough to the base that I still occasionally get invited to speak informally with young soldiers about leadership and discipline, invitations I accept because I believe, strongly, that the lessons I learned at genuine cost shouldn't simply disappear with me. Dorothy understood, better than almost anyone, the particular weight I carried from those Vietnam years, having married me in 1972, barely a year after I came home, and having spent the following decades learning exactly when to sit quietly beside me during the nights that particular ambush still visited me, and when simply to hold my hand and let the silence do whatever work words couldn't manage. We raised one daughter, Patricia, who married and had 2 children of her own, my grandson David and my granddaughter Michelle. David is the grandson who hosted Thanksgiving this year, having recently married his wife Ashley and settled into a comfortable home outside of Atlanta. I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to paint my extended family simply as disrespectful, and that isn't the complete picture. Most of my family has always shown genuine, appropriate respect for my service, understanding in general terms, if not in specific detail, that I carried real weight from those Vietnam years. A general awareness built more from Dorothy's occasional gentle explanations over the decades than from anything I'd ever volunteered directly myself. The specific issue at that Thanksgiving centered on my great-nephew, Tyler, Ashley's 17-year-old cousin, a young man I'd met perhaps 3 or 4 times before, someone with only the most surface-level awareness of who I actually was, or what I'd done. Tyler had grown up in a household, I later learned, where military service wasn't discussed much at all, no direct family connection to it, his primary exposure to military culture coming almost entirely through movies and video games, rather than any lived, personal understanding. A gap in his upbringing that, I've come to understand since, wasn't really his fault so much as simply the natural result of growing up several degrees removed from anyone who'd actually served. I arrived at David and Ashley's house 2 months ago carrying, among other things, a small box containing some old Christmas decorations I'd offered to bring along, given that David had mentioned wanting to incorporate a few older, sentimental ornaments into their first Thanksgiving hosting the extended family. I hadn't realized, packing that box somewhat hastily the evening before, that I'd also included a small drawstring pouch containing my old dog tags, an item I keep in the same closet as those decorations, close enough in proximity that it ended up mixed in without my noticing. The dinner itself started warmly enough, the usual comfortable chaos of a large family holiday gathering. Nearly 25 people spread across the dining room and an adjoining family room, the particular happy noise of multiple generations catching up simultaneously. I found myself, for the first hour or so, genuinely enjoying the occasion, catching up with relatives I don't see often enough, watching David and Ashley navigate their first major hosting effort with obvious pride. About 90 minutes into the gathering, while everyone was mingling before the meal itself, Tyler discovered the box of decorations I'd brought, apparently curious about its contents, and found the small pouch containing my dog tags tucked among the ornaments. He pulled them out, examining them with the casual curiosity of a teenager encountering an unfamiliar object, turning them over in his hands, reading the stamped information without apparently registering what it actually represented, and held them up for the room, jangling them lightly, clearly finding something amusing in the discovery. "Whose are these?" he asked, loud enough that several nearby conversations paused, holding the tags up near a string of lights so they caught the glow. "These are kind of cool, actually, like military dog tags or whatever. Did someone buy these for a costume party or something? They look pretty realistic." A cousin standing nearby laughed, the easy, careless laugh of someone amused by an offhand comment, rather than someone who'd thought carefully about what they were actually laughing at. Those might be Uncle Harold's old army stuff, right? From way back? Tyler turned toward me, holding the tags up with obvious amusement, clearly still operating under the assumption that this was some kind of harmless costume prop, rather than anything genuinely significant, his expression carrying the particular unself-conscious confidence of someone who hasn't yet learned to pause before speaking in a room full of people whose full histories he doesn't actually know. Wait, seriously, these are actually yours? That's actually pretty funny. Did you get these at like a surplus store or something for Halloween one year? Several people laughed, not entirely unkindly, but with the particular careless energy of a group finding brief amusement in a moment nobody had paused to think carefully about. I stood there, 81 years old, holding a plate of appetizers, watching my great-nephew jangle the actual metal tags I'd worn through 3 tours in Vietnam, through the deaths of 4 men I still mourn every November, as though they were a party store purchase. The specific weight of that ambush in 1968 sitting quietly in my chest, the way it always does this time of year, made considerably heavier by watching those tags treated so lightly in front of a room full of people. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though some sting was certainly present. It was something closer to a specific, tired familiarity, the particular weariness of a generation of Vietnam veterans who came home to a country that often treated our service as something uncomfortable to discuss, embarrassing even, and who've spent the decades since navigating a slow, gradual return of genuine respect, a return that clearly hadn't yet reached every corner of my own extended family. "Those are real, Tyler," I said, keeping my voice level. "I wore those across 3 tours in Vietnam. They're not a costume." Tyler's face colored slightly, some awareness apparently registering that he'd stumbled into something more significant than he'd initially assumed, though his understanding still seemed fairly surface level, more embarrassed at having said something awkward than genuinely comprehending the weight of what he was holding. "Oh," he said, "sorry, I didn't realize. That's actually really cool, I guess." He set the tags down on a nearby side table, somewhat awkwardly, and the conversation moved on, the way these moments often do, absorbed back into the general flow of a large family gathering rather than confronted directly. I didn't say anything further in that moment. I retrieved the tags quietly a few minutes later, tucking them back into their pouch, and found a quiet corner of the room to stand in briefly, absorbing the particular sting of having something so significant to me treated so casually, in front of a room full of people, many of whom I suspected genuinely didn't understand the full weight of what those tags actually represented. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advance knowledge whatsoever that it was coming. About 20 minutes after that exchange, as the family began settling toward the dining room for the meal itself, the doorbell rang. David, nearest the entrance, went to answer it, and I heard, from where I stood, a sudden shift in his voice, surprise and confusion evident even before I could see who'd arrived. "Can I help you?" David said, and I heard a deep, formal voice respond, though I couldn't make out the specific words from across the room. I made my way toward the entrance, curious about the unexpected visitor, and found David standing in the open doorway, clearly startled, facing a tall man in full army dress uniform, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, a man I recognized immediately, despite the years that had passed since I'd last seen him in person. General Marcus Ellsworth had been a young lieutenant under my direct training and mentorship nearly 4 decades earlier, one of dozens of officers who'd passed through my guidance over 22 years of training command, though Marcus, even as a young lieutenant, had shown a particular sharpness and integrity that I'd noted and invested extra attention in developing. "General Ellsworth," I said, moving past David toward the door, genuine surprise evident in my own voice. "What on earth brings you all the way out here?" The general's face broke into a broad smile, and before responding, he stepped fully into the doorway, came to complete attention, and rendered a formal salute, holding it with the particular crisp precision that comes from decades of practiced discipline. "Command Sergeant Major Bennett," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent room behind me, every conversation having stopped the moment he'd appeared in that doorway. I apologize for the interruption on your family's holiday. I'm passing through the area for a conference at Fort Benning, and I heard, through mutual contacts, that you'd be here today. I couldn't pass through this close without stopping to pay my respects properly, sir. I returned his salute, my hand less steady than it once was, and lowered it as he stepped forward to shake my hand warmly, his grip firm, his expression carrying genuine, evident respect. I want you to understand what that room looked like in that moment. Nearly 25 family members had gone completely silent, staring at the doorway where a four-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States Army, stood saluting an 81-year-old man some of them had, 20 minutes earlier, been laughing alongside a teenager mocking his dog tags as costume props. "Sir," General Ellsworth continued, still addressing me but clearly aware, now, of the audience gathered behind me, "I don't know if your family fully understands what you actually did for men like me. I was a 19-year-old lieutenant, arrogant and reckless in ways that could have gotten good soldiers killed, and Command Sergeant Major Bennett spent 18 months breaking down every bad habit I had and building something considerably more disciplined and responsible in its place. Every decision I've made in 4 decades of service since, decisions that have kept soldiers alive in combat situations I still think about regularly, trace directly back to lessons this man taught me, at considerable personal cost to himself, when I was too young and too proud to fully appreciate what he was actually giving me." He paused, glancing briefly around the silent room before continuing, his voice carrying the particular measured weight of a man accustomed to addressing rooms far larger than this one, but choosing his words now with obvious personal care rather than any formal military occasion. "I want you all to understand something," he said. "This man served 3 tours in Vietnam, a war that this country, I'm ashamed to say, often treated its returning soldiers poorly for having fought. He lost men under his direct command, men he trained personally, men whose deaths he still carries with him, I would guess, every single day since. He came home to a country that sometimes asked him to hide his own uniform rather than celebrate it, and he spent the following 22 years quietly, without seeking recognition, shaping generation after generation of soldiers and officers into people capable of making impossible decisions correctly. Work that has saved countless lives in conflicts that happened decades after his own service technically ended. I am one small example of that legacy, but I promise you, I am far from the only one." I felt my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected, the particular emotion of hearing, plainly and publicly, an acknowledgement I genuinely never sought or expected across decades of quiet, largely unrecognized service. I glanced around the room and saw several relatives with genuine tears in their eyes, Patricia among them, her hand pressed against her mouth, clearly absorbing details about her own father's service that even she, despite decades of proximity, had apparently never fully understood in these specific terms. Tyler, I noticed, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, had gone pale, his earlier casual amusement about novelty costume dog tags visibly colliding, in real time, with the sight of an actual 4-star general standing at attention, saluting the very man he'd been laughing at less than half an hour earlier. "Would you mind," General Ellsworth said, "if I stayed for just a few minutes? I genuinely love the chance to properly meet your family, sir, and I think there might be a story or two worth sharing, if you're willing." I invited him in, and what followed was a genuinely remarkable 20 minutes, General Ellsworth sharing, with careful, appropriate discretion, specific stories about the training program I'd once run, about the particular judgment calls I'd made that had shaped his own career, and, by extension, the lives of countless soldiers who'd served under his command in the decades since. He described, in general terms he was permitted to share, the specific ambush in 1968 that I still mourn every November, explaining to a room of stunned relatives that the discipline and tactical judgment I'd built into every soldier I subsequently trained had directly prevented, by his estimation, considerably worse outcomes in at least 2 combat situations he'd personally witnessed decades later. Tyler approached me quietly, once General Ellsworth had finally taken his leave, promising to stay in touch and thanking my family again for their hospitality. My great-nephew's earlier casual confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by something considerably more subdued and genuinely apologetic. "Uncle Harold," he said, "I am so sorry about earlier. I had no idea, genuinely no idea, what those tags actually meant. I feel like a complete idiot." "You're not an idiot, Tyler," I said. "You're 17 years old, and nobody in your life has ever sat you down and explained what men and women who served, particularly from a war like Vietnam, actually carried home with them. That's not really your fault. It's on all of us, the ones who lived through it, for not doing a better job explaining it to your generation before you had reason to encounter it carelessly." "Can you tell me more?" he asked. "Like, actually tell me the real story? Not right now if you don't want to, but sometime." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that request. A genuine, if belated curiosity from a young man who'd started the afternoon treating my service as a costume punchline. I told him I'd be glad to, and over the following weeks, Tyler has actually followed through on that request, calling twice now, asking careful, genuinely engaged questions about my service, about the specific men I lost in 1968, about what coming home to a hostile country had actually felt like for a 19-year-old who'd already given considerably more than most people his age could imagine. In the 2 months since that Thanksgiving, something has genuinely shifted in how my broader family discusses and understands my service. David has asked, more than once, if I'd be willing to record some of my stories, wanting a more permanent record for future generations of the family. An offer I've begun taking seriously, sitting for several recorded conversations already. My grandson patiently helping me organize decades of memory into something coherent enough for people who weren't there to actually understand. We've recorded nearly 6 hours so far, covering everything from my earliest days in basic training through the specific weight of that 1968 ambush. David asking careful, respectful questions that told me he was genuinely listening rather than simply collecting material out of obligation. Patricia called me the week after Thanksgiving, her voice still carrying evident emotion, to tell me she'd spent decades assuming she understood the general shape of my service without ever fully grasping its actual weight, and that hearing General Ellsworth describe it so plainly had made her realize how much she'd never thought to ask directly herself. "Dad," she said, "I think I was scared to ask, worried it might hurt you to talk about it. I didn't realize that not asking might have hurt, in its own different way, making you feel like something so significant just didn't matter enough to anyone to ask about." Tyler, for his part, has become something of an unexpected regular presence in my life since that Thanksgiving. Beyond our phone calls, he visited in person last month, driving 2 hours specifically to spend an afternoon with me, bringing a notebook and asking careful, genuinely engaged questions about specific aspects of my service, taking notes the way a young person does when they've decided something actually matters enough to remember properly. He told me, during that visit, that he'd started researching Vietnam War history on his own, wanting to understand the broader context that had shaped my generation's experience, and that he'd specifically sought out material about how returning veterans had been treated, wanting to understand the full weight of what I'd described about that airport restroom all those decades ago. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old soldier whose dog tags were mistaken for a costume. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. An entire generation of Vietnam veterans came home to a country that often treated our service with discomfort rather than respect, and the effects of that reception echoed forward, in smaller ways, across decades, sometimes landing, carelessly, on dinner tables held by grandchildren and great-nephews, who never had the chance to learn what we actually carried. That doesn't mean the weight of that service was ever diminished by careless jokes. It means the story was simply waiting, patiently, for someone curious enough, or surprised enough, to finally ask the right questions. I spent decades carrying dog tags that represented some of the heaviest moments of my life, only to have them briefly mistaken for a costume prop by a great-nephew who simply never had reason to know better. It took a 4-star general walking through an unexpected doorway to finally show my family the weight those tags actually carried, but it's taken considerably longer, in the months since, for that recognition to become the kind of real, ongoing understanding that a single dramatic moment alone could never fully provide. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family whose service or sacrifice you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.